Well, here we are again. Another windy day. You may hear the birds in the background, and you may see a few butterflies wandering around, but I'm interested in the concept of how the agenda, how the political, social and cultural agenda is set in any society. But specifically I want to look at Australian society, and I want to look at the domination of the Murdoch empire, how it continues to dominate in terms of setting the daily, the weekly, the monthly, the yearly agenda in this country, and how it does that, because I think it's important that people understand that the advent of social media and the World Wide Web has not really changed the dynamics about who sets the political, social and cultural agenda in this country and in many other parts of the world. Now, in Australia, the Murdoch media has dominated views for a long time, as well as dominating views in England and much of the English-speaking world, including the United States of America. So why is it still important? Why is the legacy media still important? Why is print media still important? Why is the fact that the Murdoch empire, which to me is nothing more than a degenerative neurological disorder which destroys the mind and the body and the soul of those who are exposed to it constantly, why is it so important? Well, with the rise of social media, what we have seen is the lack of resources which are pumped into journalism, especially investigative journalism. So, unlike what most people think, the rise of social media has actually blunted the influence of the legacy media. It has actually increased the influence of legacy media, because to a significant degree what you see on social media is what I'm talking about, opinion basically, not fact. So how does it work? It works very simply. Now, there's only one national newspaper in Australia, and that's the Australian. And the Murdoch empire has never made 1 cent. If we believe in capitalism, which is private investment for private profit, the Australian newspaper should have been closed down years ago. As well as the Murdoch media dominating the national landscape of the Australian newspaper, it also dominates the views that are printed in most of Australia, especially Queensland. Queensland has been a one newspaper state now for over 6 decades. It's no exaggeration that the Bjelke-Petersen government was able to last for so long because of the support of the Murdoch media. But let's get back to 2020. So how does it work? Well, every day ideas come forth in the print media, and these ideas are determined by editorial policy. And the print media decides what is news and what isn't news, what is to be discussed, what will be the news of the day. And if you say to me, well, not many people read newspapers, you're quite correct. The number of people who are reading newspapers has fallen dramatically, and it's difficult for newspapers to actually make a profit. So why do they continue to exist? They continue to exist because the print media, whether it's just in a newspaper form or on the social media, its extension to the social media, it continues to exist because it sets the agenda for the day. Now, radio stations, whether they're owned privately or whether they're government owned, like the Australian Broadcasting Corporation's radio stations, television stations, whether they're privately owned or government owned, basically get their news from the legacy media. So what appears in the legacy media that morning dominates the discussion politically, socially and culturally in the rest of the country. So what that means is that what appears is the topic for discussion on multiple radio stations, the topic of discussions on multiple television stations. At the same time, it becomes the topic of discussion on the Twitter stream. It becomes a topic of discussion on Instagram. It becomes the topic of discussion on Facebook and the World Wide Web. Although there are many competing viewpoints on these new platforms, the major topic for discussion every day is directed at what appears in the legacy media, that's the print media, either in its print form or its social media form, what appears in those publications. So what you hear on television, so what you see on television, what you hear on radio, the discussion which occurs on social media is directed by what appears in the legacy media that day. So if you have a monopoly on the legacy media, you have a monopoly on the ideas which are discussed, the ideas which become part and parcel of the food and water of the population. Because if every day you have the same opinions which are broadcast, not forced down your throats, which are broadcast, what you do, as other people have said in the past, is to manufacture a consensus about what is important, what isn't important. It's quite extraordinary that years later, years after the introduction of social media, we continue to have forced down our throats collectively the idea that coal is still a viable industry, that climate change doesn't exist, that a treaty with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders would be some type of national disaster, and the list goes on and on. And we've seen constantly how the legacy media continues to dominate that discussion. So that monopoly, which is a government monopoly to a significant degree, determines the parliamentary agenda. As we saw during the last federal election, when the Australian Labor Party attempted to put a discussion about negative gearing and taxpayer funds for stockholders on the agenda, that we saw them lose what was described as the unlosable election. And to a significant degree this occurred because of that constant outpouring of the same ideas which are editorially fashioned on a daily basis, every day, every week, every month, every year. It's the same debate. And what's occurred today is that facts no longer are important. What the legacy media, especially the Murdoch media to a significant degree, is responsible for is actually camouflaging facts. It's actually ignoring facts. It's what the Murdoch empire has always been about. It's about Mr. Murdoch and his family and his business. It's about what creates a profit for them is what is important. And if you're going to lose money on a legacy media, it doesn't matter as long as you've got that political influence which stops the growth of political parties and political movements in this country which challenge the status quo, which challenge those assumptions that we live in an egalitarian society, which challenge the assumptions that we live in a democratic society, which challenge the assumptions that we live in a society where if you put in the effort you get the just rewards, which challenges the assumptions there's no corporate corruption, that it's the leaners and movers, that the leaners are those who receive social security benefits and the movers are those in the corporate world. So this is the dilemma. And what we've seen is not just the legacy media, the privately owned legacy media go down that path, but we've seen a concerted attack on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation for a variety of mechanisms over the last 3 decades, which has diluted the range of opinions which you hear and see on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Opinions which would have been mainstream 3 decades ago, opinions like struggles against privatisations, somehow become irrelevant. And they've done this in a number of ways. One is a constant attack on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. And let's not forget the Liberal Party policy is to privatise the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. The second important initiative was to introduce short-term contracts. So that means that presenters and editorial staff are basically facing a loss of work, a loss of a job, if they stray from what is considered to be legitimate analysis. And the other situation is a lack of funding for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So if you have an Australian Broadcasting Corporation which basically mirrors what you hear and see in the private sector because of they've been gelded by the government for a variety of ways, then you have the situation we have today, where there is no discussion about privatisation, there is no discussion about globalisation, there is no discussion about corporatisation, minimal discussion about deregulation. There's always attacks on the trade union movement. There's attacks on any social movement which occurs, whether it's the climate emergency people, whether it's people who are after rights, whether it's refugees or asylum seekers, whether it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We see the same ideas constantly, and this percolates into the community. Instead of having a community which questions the basic assumptions that we see in the legacy media, we have a community which accepts those assumptions, accepts that people with unemployment benefits are basically shirkers and leaners, accepts the assumptions that there is no other way of tackling the current economic crisis, accepts the assumption that COVID-19 can only be attacked in a particular way, and the list goes on. And that's what makes the legacy media such an important part and parcel of the way that we live. The ideas that are common in the community, the ideas that we see and hear on a regular basis. So there is no discussion, there is no alternative. What we have is the dominant media and nothing else. It's not the mainstream media, it's the dominant media. And its dominant message is very simple, that private investment is necessary for private profit. And the only way this society can function is by concentrating the power so that small sections of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange, and very importantly, communication. For if the agenda is set on a daily basis by corporations whose major responsibility is to create ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders, irrespective of the national, environmental, personal cost in society, then what we see is what we have today in this country. We have people fighting against their own interests because they have complete faith in the agenda which is set every day. Somehow they think that people who are fighting for a different world or a better world are somehow ungrateful. They don't understand what's happening. It's quite extraordinary the type of viewpoints you come across in the community regarding poverty, regarding social security benefits, regarding the COVID-19 crisis. It's just extraordinary. And to a significant degree, many of these viewpoints are exactly the same viewpoints which are put forward by the legacy media. Now, it wouldn't really matter if they didn't influence society. But the whole purpose of the Murdoch empire, and it dominates the private communication networks in this country. It dominates print media. It dominates, television. And to a significant degree, what they're interested in is having that power to influence parliamentary legislation. And what we see constantly, whenever legislation is put forward which will have an impact on their profitability, we see them using their monopoly on the media to promote their viewpoint and not give anybody else the opportunity to promote their viewpoint. And if you think you live in a three society where there is three communication, there isn't three communication. The only reason I'm talking today on the net and I'm tolerated, as you're tolerated, is because we're basically ineffective and have minimal power. If we were in effective opposition and we had a greater amount of power, as we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis, it's very easy for governments to remove any rights and liberties you think you constitutionally enjoy. You don't enjoy those rights and liberties, as we've seen over and over again. So the legacy media, the monopoly held by the Murdoch empire and the legacy media continues to be a blight on this country. It continues to hold us back. So, it's easy to say it's a blight, but what are we going to do about it? Every major political party, every major social movement in this country is basically a hostage to the Murdoch empire's monopoly on setting the agenda in this country. Whether it's the agenda about race relations, about a treaty, about trade unions, about inequality, about corporations, about government, who's going to rule us. Every single issue is dominated. Every single political party is a hostage to the Murdoch empire's media because it makes or breaks political parties. Every single social movement is a hostage. You can see what they do to the trade union movement, where to be a trade unionist in 2020 is almost to be a criminal instead of being a respected member of society. And the list goes on and on. So what will we do about this? Well, there's a number of things we can do. We can just accept and say that's the price of living in Australia, and if you want to get anywhere, you really have to follow the Murdoch empire's social, political and cultural and economic agenda, or we can say, stuff it. We can say it's time that we took some action to ensure that we had a diverse media in this country. I'll give you an example. During the Eureka rebellion on the 3rd of December 1854, there were 5 newspapers in Ballarat, with a population of 30,000 people. 5 newspapers. 4 of them supported the rebellion. It was their consistent effort on a daily basis which ensured that the 13 people who were tried for high treason were acquitted, and the ringleaders of the rebellion became members of Parliament within 12 months of the rebellion. If it wasn't for that independent, strong independent media, the story about the Eureka rebellion would have been forgotten. In 2020, we face our own Eureka moment. We either break the monopoly of the Murdoch empire, or we continue to drift along and make no contributions to the change that is necessary. We'll continue to deny the climate emergency. We'll continue to deny the reality that we need a treaty for Indigenous Australians. We will continue to deny the inequalities that exist in this country. We will continue to deny the power the corporate world has over us. So I'm encouraging you to join a political party that does not care about the Murdoch empire. We don't care what they say. They will not determine our policies. We determine our policies on the basis of direct democracy. We are here to make the changes that are needed. We have no fear of the monopoly of the legacy media and social media. We wish to encourage you to join this growing political, social and cultural movement to ensure we break the domination of the Murdoch empire on the future of this country. We face exceptionally important issues. We need to address those issues. Without your help, we will never be able to address those issues. So I encourage you to look at our website, pipsy.net, have a look at what we have to say. If you're interested, join. Download the application form from pipsy.net. If you're not on the computer, and I don't know why you'd be watching this if you're not on the computer, you can always leave a message on 0439 395 489, 0439 395 489, and they'll send you out a few application forms. Thank you once again for looking at this YouTube presentation. Next week we'll look at another issue, but it's important that the Murdoch empire's media monopoly is broken by people who don't care about the power they are able to force on us, because we are a much more powerful organisation than they'll ever be, because we have the interests of the public, the many, at heart, not the interests of the few like the Murdoch empire.